Thank you. This is the story of my parents, which are your grandparents, great grandparents. Wow. My father and mother come from a part of Poland, is now part of the Ukraine, and the area, the major city for the Jewish community in that area is today known as Lvov or Lviv. In Yiddish, I know it was called Lemberg, perhaps in Germany also known as Lemberg. My father was born in 1901. My mother was born in 1908. My father didn't like growing up in that area. When he was a teenager or early 20s, he was offered an opportunity to go into business with a family member or something. He didn't like it. He was in his late teens, I believe, which makes it around 1920. He hitchhiked down to the tip of Italy, where he took a ship to Palestine. He stayed in Palestine. He worked on a private farm, and the owner of the farm was interested in my father, obviously, and sent him to study agriculture in California. And this was in the early 1920s, or maybe late teens. My father, when he reached New York, came down with malaria, which he had obviously caught in the years that he worked in Palestine. And he never had chance to travel to California to the agricultural school that he was supposed to attend. He just stayed until he got cured of his malaria, and there were plenty of young Jewish people, immigrants, in the Lower East Side. He joined that community. He had a bunch of bachelor friends. He was a bachelor. And New York City, there were plenty of young Jewish women around. He must have had a good, he had plenty of friends, and he enjoyed life in the United States.
What did he do for work?
He worked, to the best of my knowledge, he worked always in the millinery line, just as a laborer, or maybe at a sewing machine, because he was very skillful at that. I remember my father and mother, for all the years that I was very young, making my mother's dresses, and he'd work the sewing machine, or she would, but they were a great team. It's a coincidence. One of his friends was a dentist in the Lower East Side. This dentist's daughter lives in Great Neck now. She's essentially a contemporary of mine. And later on, there'll be a story. I've got a memo of when I went to, I'm jumping. I went to Poland, and I got a gift of a violin, and that gift ended up in the United States in the hands of this woman who's the granddaughter of a bachelor friend of my father's, and she wrecked the violin, but I've still got it in the house as a souvenir. My father got to the United States, came down, cured himself of malaria, and became a citizen of the United States. And he made sure he was a citizen before he went home, but he didn't want to go back until he got a citizenship, because he was afraid if he'd go to Poland, he'd be drafted into the Polish army, and then who would know where and how his life would commence. In 1928, my father apparently saved up enough money, was established well enough in the United States. He wanted to go back to visit his parents. He went back to visit his parents, and at the same time, they were living in Peremyshlyany, and I don't know when or how. I don't remember if my mom or dad told me the story, or if they did. I forgot it. But they somehow met in Peremyshlyany, fell in love, got married, all very quickly before they came back to the United States, which was in the late 20s. They were married in Poland. They met in Poland, they were married, they had a nice Jewish wedding. I don't know how big the party was, I don't remember any stories about that either. but they came back to the United States.
What month was that? Do you know?
1929.
December?
I think December 1st. Yeah, it was right after the crash. I think they arrived right after the crash.
Okay, I don't remember that. So they're married, they're living in New York, in Manhattan. My father's working July 31st, 1931. Okay, I'm on the scene, and by 1935, my father apparently saved up enough money for my mother to take the trip to go home with me, obviously to meet my grandparents. It was interesting. The ship that we went from New York to France, and from France took a train. I'll get to that in a minute. The ship was a French liner. The name of it was Champlain. I have the dates. It doesn't matter when it was. It was in the springtime. We left New York, and the first memory I have of the trip on the ship was one morning. We're in the dining room having breakfast. This is mid-ocean, someplace in the middle of the Atlantic, and everybody is leaving, walking out, and going on the deck. And the reason they were going on the deck is the major ship, the largest cruise ship at the time in the world, the Normandy, was the French line also, was making its maiden voyage from France to the United States. So when two ships from the same shipping line meet in the middle of the ocean, they salute each other. So everybody went on the deck. What does it mean to salute, for a ship to salute another ship? They blow the steam whistle, which is a very, very loud horn. And everybody's on the deck and looking and cheering or whatever. And I'm crying, and my mother's got me in her arms. And I remember crying and being upset because the noise of the steam whistle, and the steam condenses on this whistle. So there's this little bit of a spray. And if the wind blows in the right direction, it blows, on you. Well, it blew on me. And maybe the other people who stood near me, but they didn't know, or they were adults, and it didn't matter. So for the 20 minutes or half hour, whatever it is, for the two ships to come close enough, and with the steam whistles blowing all the time until they pass, that was the experience, the only experience that I recall on that ship. We got off the boat. The next thing, the next memory I have is being in Berlin, at the train station in Berlin. So obviously we ended up taking a train from the port in France to Berlin. Why did I go to Berlin? My father had an aunt that was living in Berlin, Germany at the time. And when the train got to Berlin, my mother and we both got off the train, and we had one big steamer trunk, is that what you call them? Which carried all our clothing, and my mother apparently wanted to get a porter to take this big trunk down to the street to get a cab that we could go to my father's aunt, where we stayed for, I think, only one night, at most maybe 2 nights. What was the highlight of that trip? Well, first of all, my mother left me alone at the train station, sitting on the steamer trunk until she found a porter to come back. Interesting. Left me all by myself with a steamer trunk in Berlin. What I remember doing when in Berlin, where my father's aunt lived, was going into a 5 and dime store, like a Kresge's was the name, I believe. It's a German department store chain. I think they were in the United States too. And my mother bought for my father to take home. He smoked. She bought a cigarette lighter, Why do I remember? You know, a cigarette lighter, it makes fire, so that I must have been intrigued by that as a purchase. But that's all that I remember of being in Berlin. I don't remember my father's aunt's house or meeting her. I just remember the cigarette lighter. So we stayed there a day or two, and then the train continued to Lemberg in Poland, Lvov today. I don't remember anything of the trip, but I sort of have a remembrance of some sort of a wagon taking us from the train station to my grandparents' house. I don't remember meeting them. I don't remember any big greetings or anything. My next memories are things that happened while I was living in the house. My grandmother had an oven that she made on Fridays for Shabbat. She baked breads, and I threw a log. I don't know how big a log it could have been if I was 4 years old, and I don't know how I did it, but I hit her in the head. She had a wound. She had to have a Band-Aid or something for some attention. I just remember being scolded for that. The oven where she baked the breads for Shabbat was outside the house. The rest of the season was inside. They didn't have indoor plumbing. They had an outhouse which was behind the house. I know they had a pump in the backyard. I doubt it. Yeah, I do not know. Sir, I don't think so. Well,
No,
they had an outhouse, so there was no water for flushing,
Right.
no toilet. So I believe that there was no running water in the house.
From what I surmised when I look at the picture of the pump, is that it looked like a hose that ran from the pump, possibly to the house.
Like to fill a
Like
basin,
you'd pump it, and somebody outside would pump it, maybe it would go into a vessel in the house.
right, like a
I don't know if they had
washing
to carry
basin.
it in pails. I'll show you that sometime. This one looks like
And I sort of recollect that the pump was between two houses. The well was shared. How many of the family lived? My mother had two brothers, a younger brother and an older brother. My mother had 5 sisters that were living in the house. Other than the pictures, one or two pictures I've got of me with some or all of them. I have no particular memories. I do have memory of my mother's younger brother, who was living in the house still. He wasn't married at that time. I don't know whether he ever did get married. He worked in a lumber mill, and I remember him taking me there, and I remember being frightened by when a big saw would cut some lumber thing. It made a lot of noise, and I don't know, I wasn't happy. Now, my father's father lived in the same town of Peremyshlyany, but I don't know, it was a walk away. I don't remember taking a cab, a horse-drawn wagon or anything. But we did visit my father's parents also.
Did your grandparents from your father's side and your mother's side, did they have a relationship?
Well, by the time we went there, they obviously knew each other. They were certainly at the wedding a couple of years
Right.
earlier.
But you don't know if they
I have no
got
idea
together
what the
ever?
relationship was, but I have no, when I was we stayed all the time because it was my mother's house.
Right.
We stayed there all the time. We visited my father's house, I don't know how frequently, but how long were we there? How long did we stay here?
it was 3 or 4 months.
How many?
3 or 4 months. Yeah.
Okay, we probably saw them a lot of times. I remember somebody taking me to the train station in Peremyshlyany, and what I remember about it is, you know what seltzer bottles are like, where you push a button and the seltzer.
Yeah.
Well, I remember at the train station that somebody had a vendor had a large bottle, not about a quart. It was but several gallons. And when the trains would come into the station, he would go along to the windows and sell a glass of seltzer and pass it up through the window. That's what I remember of the trains in Peremyshlyany. Stopping and then getting your seltzer. It's interesting what a child remembers of something.
You remember going to temple at all?
Never went to temple.
Never went to temple.
No, my father was never they were more secular Jews than religious Jews. They spoke Yiddish.
Right.
I don't know that they knew how to read Hebrew like I do.
Right.
Okay, but I don't know whether they knew what they were reading in the Hebrew anymore
Than we do.
than I do.
Right.
And if they had a siddur, I'm sure that the translation was in Yiddish.
Right.
So you had Hebrew and then in Yiddish.
Do you remember family meals together?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember being together, like having large family meals?
No, none. I don't remember. I do remember going from Peremyshlyany to a neighboring town, Zolochiv, where my cousin Mark's grandparents had a delicatessen or a restaurant or something. I don't know why I call it a deli. That's what and what do I remember of it was that from the front of the store to the back of the store, they had an intercom. And it wasn't the phone, and it did use up electricity. Or maybe it did. And that's when I met Marek. And we talked to each other when we went to this town. We played with this phone thing a lot, and that intrigued me. First time I ever knew of a telephone.
Did you speak Yiddish at this
Only
point?
what I may have learned there. I don't think my parents taught me Yiddish, and I don't know that they, when I was growing up, they were more interested in me speaking English. Okay, when I went to my father's parents and two brothers lived in Peremyshlyany, and it was a walk from my mother's parents' house to my father's parents' house. I remember he had two brothers, and they played games with me. And the game we played was they had some sort of a trinket or a something, and they'd make it disappear. No, we'd lie down in a bed with it, and they'd hold it. Then it disappeared, and then we would go looking all over the house for this, and they'd have it palmed or something, and they'd get to wherever they wanted to be, and they found it. And maybe they at one of those times they repeated it. You do those things more than once, and they just made it so that I was the one who caught it next time. And I remember them playing that game with me. There was nobody there that spoke English, at least that I met.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember ever speaking to anybody other than my mother on that whole trip.
Now, your mother says, going back in a few stories, can I add something? She said that by the time you came back, your Yiddish was very good. And when you went down on the street to play with your friends, you got really embarrassed because your Brooklyn friends said to you, why are you talking that language? We don't do that here. And you came up to your mother's house and you said, I'm never saying that language. Don't talk in front of me like that. I'm not talking that language anymore. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't know it.
I've heard that before.
I heard that, yeah.
All right, my mother's house, I know didn't have flush toilets like we have. There was an outhouse behind it. My father's parents didn't have an outhouse in the back, but down in the basement of the building, they had a big pile of sawdust, and there was a particular corner you went and sprinkled some sawdust and did whatever you had to do, and then covered it up with more sawdust. And somebody came and cleaned up all the sawdust. But that's what I remember, instead of having a regular toilet. That's clear memory, because those things kids remember. I have no particular memories of the day we left. I don't remember getting on the train. I don't remember anything of the return trip until I was on the Normandy, which was the ship that we saluted on the way to Europe. That was making another trip home to New York. That's a ship that we went on. What I do remember was on the top deck, above where normal passages were, there was one higher than open to all the passengers. They had a small deck that was a children's playground. They had tricycles that you could ride around up there, and they had, I remember, a puppet stage for somebody that did a puppet show. I don't remember the puppet show, but I do remember the box and the curtain on it. My father, meanwhile, when we left for Europe, we were living, and I don't know how long, together with my tante and uncle. Sylvan, cousin Sylvan's parents. We left from their house to the boat in New York. We went to Europe. When we came back, my father had rented an apartment.
It was a new apartment? You came back to a different home?
We came back to it, I'm pretty sure, unless we went back to Stoughton the first night. But my father, on 68th Street, between 18th Avenue and 19th Avenue. Whatever it was, we were only there for a year or two, and then we moved to 71st Street. The apartment houses still exist. It's still a very populated area. It's predominantly Orthodox Jews in that part of Borough Park. We lived in an apartment building. We had an apartment. We were home. Any other questions about the trip to Poland?
Aside from magic tricks, do you remember playing with anything? You have some pictures.
I vaguely have remembrance of trying to roll a hoop with another stick, but I don't remember whether they ever succeeded in doing that. And I just don't remember any of those details. I don't remember it ever raining. I'm sure it did. Let's finish up the trip. I'm back in the United States. Well, the first thing that my mother told me was that when I went downstairs, I used to get my languages mixed up, and the kids would either make fun of me, and that's why my mother didn't want any more. My father and mother occasionally spoke. They spoke English and Yiddish when I grew up.
Right.
I don't remember what most of the time, but it was most comfortable for them. I can remember that we would, on 13th Avenue in Borough Park, which is still a very popular shopping area. I remember vendors that walked the streets in autumn and winter selling baked potatoes or baked sweet potatoes. And I remember on the first day that I went to kindergarten, I was so excited that when I got to the corner, there was a policeman in the street. And you know, policemen, when they take through traffic, they don't, nobody go to diagonals. You do two right turns, you know, you make two right turns or two left turns, but you don't go diagonally. Well, from the street where the corner I was to the school was a diagonal. And whether it was a policeman or not, I ran across it and I got yelled at by the policeman. But that's already months after my return from college.
Skrzypce łkają, czarowne tango gra.